Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 17 through chapter 23, verse 44. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites, and tell them, when any man from the house of Israel or from the foreigners in Israel presents his offering for any of the votive or freewill offerings which they present to the Lord as a burnt offering, if it is to be acceptable for your benefit, it must be a flawless male from the cattle, sheep, or goats. You must not present anything that has a flaw, because it will not be acceptable for your benefit. If a man presents a peace offering sacrifice to the Lord for a special votive offering, or for a free will offering from the herd or the flock, it must be flawless to be acceptable. It must have no flaw. You must not present to the Lord something blind, or with a broken bone, or mutilated, or with a running sore, or with a festering eruption, or with a feverish rash. You must not give any of these as a gift on the altar to the Lord. As for an ox or a sheep with a limb too long or stunted, you may present it as a free will offering, but it will not be acceptable for a votive offering. You must not present to the Lord something with testicles that are bruised, crushed, torn, or cut off. You must not do this in your land. Even from a foreigner you must not present the food of your God from such animals as these, for they are ruined and flawed. They will not be acceptable for your benefit. The Lord spoke to Moses, "When an ox, lamb, or goat is born, it must be under the care of its mother 7 days. But from the eighth day onward, it will be acceptable as an offering gift to the Lord. You must not slaughter an ox or a sheep and its young on the same day. When you sacrifice a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, you must sacrifice it so that it is acceptable for your benefit. On that very day it must be eaten. You must not leave any part of it over until morning. I am the Lord. You must be sure to do my commandments. I am the Lord. You must not profane my holy name, and I will be sanctified in the midst of the Israelites. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, the one who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord." The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, these are the Lord's appointed times, which you must proclaim as holy assemblies, my appointed times. 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there must be a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy assembly. You must not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all the places where you live. These are the Lord's appointed times, holy assemblies, which you must proclaim at their appointed time. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is a Passover offering to the Lord. Then on the 15th day of the same month will be the festival of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day there will be a holy assembly for you. You must not do any regular work. You must present a gift to the Lord for 7 days, and the 7th day is a holy assembly. You must not do any regular work." The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land that I am about to give you, and you gather in its harvest, then you must bring the sheaf of the first portion of your harvest to the priest. And he must wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for your benefit. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest is to wave it. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must also offer a flawless yearling lamb for a burnt offering to the Lord, along with its grain offering, 2/10 of an ephah of choice wheat flour mixed with olive oil, as a gift to the Lord, a soothing aroma, and its drink offering, 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat bread, roasted grain, or fresh grain until this very day, until you bring the offering of your God. This is a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all the places where you live. You must count for yourselves 7 weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day you bring the wave offering sheaf. They must be complete weeks. You must count 50 days until the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then you must present a new grain offering to the Lord. From the places where you live, you must bring 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering. They must be made from 2/10 of an ephah of fine wheat flour baked with yeast, as first fruits to the Lord. Along with the loaves of bread, you must also present 7 flawless yearling lambs, 1 young bull, and 2 rams. They are to be a burnt offering to the Lord, along with their grain offering and drink offerings, a gift of a soothing aroma to the Lord. You must also offer 1 male goat for a sin offering, and 2 yearling lambs for a peace offering sacrifice. and the priest is to wave them, the 2 lambs along with the bread of the firstfruits, as a wave offering before the Lord. They will be holy to the Lord for the priest. On this very day you must proclaim an assembly. It is to be a holy assembly for you. You must not do any regular work. This is a perpetual statute in all the places where you live throughout your generations. When you gather in the harvest of your land, you must not completely harvest the corner of your field, and you must not gather up the gleanings of your harvest. You must leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you must have a complete rest, a memorial announced by loud horn blasts, a holy assembly. You must not do any regular work, but you must present a gift to the Lord." The Lord spoke to Moses, "The 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It is to be a holy assembly for you, and you must humble yourselves and present a gift to the Lord. You must not do any work on this particular day, because it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for yourselves before the Lord your God. Indeed, any person who does not behave with humility on this particular day will be cut off from his people. As for any person who does any work on this particular day, I will exterminate that person from the midst of his people. You must not do any work. This is a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all the places where you live. It is a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you must humble yourselves on the 9th day of the month in the evening. From evening until evening, you must observe your Sabbath. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, on the 15th day of this 7th month is the festival of temporary shelters for 7 days to the Lord. On the 1st day is a holy assembly. You must do no regular work. For 7 days you must present a gift to the Lord. On the 8th day there is to be a holy assembly for you, and you must present a gift to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly day. You must not do any regular work. These are the appointed times of the Lord that you must proclaim as holy assemblies, to present a gift to the Lord, burnt offering, grain offering, sacrifice, and drink offerings, each day according to its regulation. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord and all your gifts, votive offerings, and freewill offerings, which you must give to the Lord, on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you gather in the produce of the land, you must celebrate a pilgrim festival of the Lord for 7 days. On the 1st day is a complete rest. On the 8th day is a complete rest. On the 1st day you must take for yourselves branches from majestic trees, palm branches, branches of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you must rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You must celebrate it as a pilgrim festival to the Lord for 7 days in the year. This is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. You must celebrate it in the 7th month. You must live in temporary shelters for 7 days. Every native citizen in Israel must live in temporary shelters, so that your future generations may know that I made the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So Moses spoke to the Israelites about the appointed times of the Lord. Yeah. So you had the first part there, which was about the types of offering animals which are acceptable and not acceptable. And then you have detailed the times of the religious festivals for the Israelites. So let's see what Guzik has to say. A male without blemish from the cattle. In several places before this, God declared that blemished, defective, or deformed animals were unacceptable for sacrifice to the Lord. The priests were responsible to make certain that an animal brought for sacrifice did not have an observable blemish or defect. God didn't want the cast-offs as sacrifices from the people. He had the right to receive the best they could offer. Yeah. And it reminds me of, I think it's Malachi, where he says, try offering these gifts to a king. And he said essentially that they were robbing the temple because they brought him what was worthless. Unfortunately, this law was abused in the days of Jesus, where priests sometimes disqualified an animal for an insignificant reason. Then the corrupt priest might require the purchase of an approved sacrificial animal at a dishonest high price. Yeah, boy. A male without blemish. A male for a burnt offering, which was always of that kind, but the females were accepted in peace offerings. It must be perfect. The Hebrew word here really means complete, whole, sound, or unimpaired. In this context, it is the opposite of defective. This was also a picture of the Messiah to come, and the sacrifice he would offer, and be a perfect sacrifice. Those that are blind or broken or maimed. These are blemishes that might be caused by a birth defect, such as an animal that came out maimed in some manner. Animals diseased with an ulcer or eczema or scabs were also not acceptable for sacrifice. Nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these. God would not accept such defective sacrifices from an Israelite or from a foreigner. If an Israelite brought a castrated animal from a foreigner's hand, they could not offer it. From the 8th day and thereafter it shall be acceptable as an offering. It was also prohibited to offer an animal less than 8 days old. This was unnecessary cruelty to a newborn animal, and the practice was probably performed in pagan sacrifices to idols. Do not kill both her and her young on the same day. To sacrifice a newborn or young animal and the mother of the animal on the same day was to imitate a Canaanite fertility ritual. This was forbidden to Israel. These laws may have had a polemical function against pagan practices, or they may merely promote sensitivities and high regard for life. Therefore you shall keep my commandments and perform them. Here God gave Israel, especially the priests, 4 reasons to keep his commandments and to honor his name. Because of who God is, I'm the Lord. Because of what he is, my holy name. Because of what he is doing, I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. And because of what he has done, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Yeah. Given what God does and who he is, he certainly had a right to command the Israelites to only approach him in the ways that he did. And then you have the feasts to the Lord. The major theme in all these feasts is gratitude for what God has done and what God continues to give. Special displays of the mercy, kindness, and providential care of God should be particularly remembered when we recollect that we deserve nothing at his hands. And the debt of gratitude is all the debt we can pay. In it we should be cheerful, fervent, and frequent. An ungrateful heart is an unfeeling, unloving, unbelieving, and disobedient heart. Reader, pray to God that he may deliver thee from its influence and its curse. From Clark. The feasts of Purim and Hanukkah are not addressed in this chapter, since these feasts celebrate events that occurred after Moses' time. Yeah. Purim being the lot, essentially, which happened in the days of Esther. And then I think Hanukkah was celebrated as a result of what happened in the Maccabees, but I'm not sure. The seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. The Sabbath was not properly a feast like the 7 feasts to follow in this chapter. It was, however, a holy convocation, a day set apart not only for solemn rest, but also for the sacred gathering of the people of God. Centuries after this, when the Jewish people were scattered in exile, they started to meet in synagogues on the morning of the Sabbath. The only appointed place for sacrifice was the altar at the tabernacle, yet it may be that even before the establishment of the synagogue in exile, Israelites gathered on the Sabbath in a holy convocation, meeting to pray together and hear from the teaching Levites spread around the land of Israel. The word translated Sabbath and rest have the same root in Hebrew, and the word for seventh is also very similar. Like everything in the Bible, we understand the Sabbath of solemn rest from the perspective of the whole Bible, not only this single passage. With this understanding, we see that there is a real sense in which Jesus fulfilled the purpose and plan of the Sabbath for us and in us. Jesus is our rest. When we remember his finished work, we remember the Sabbath and we remember the rest. Therefore, the whole of Scripture makes it clear that under the new covenant, no one is under obligation to observe a Sabbath day. From Colossians 2, 16 and 17 and Galatians 4, 9 through 11. Colossians 2, 16 and 17, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holiday, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. In Galatians 4, 9 through 11, but now after that you have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days, and months, and times, and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This tells us that Christians are not bound to observe days and months and seasons and years. The rest we enter into as Christians is something to experience every day, not just one day of a week. This is the rest of knowing we don't have to work to save ourselves, but our salvation is accomplished in Jesus Christ. Then you have the Lord's Passover here. On the 14th day of the first month, on the Jewish ceremonial calendar, the first month was known as Nisan. Passover was held on the 14th of Nisan each year. Twilight was the end of one day and the beginning of the new day. The Lord's Passover. The account of the first Passover is told in Exodus 12. When Israel was a slave people in Egypt, through Moses, God sent a series of plagues upon Egypt to convince Pharaoh to set the Hebrews free and allow them to go to Canaan. When the plagues did not convince Pharaoh, God sent one final plague, the death of the firstborn in every household across the land of Egypt. The households of the people of Israel were spared this terrible judgment, if they followed God's command to sacrifice a lamb and apply its blood to the top and sides of the doorway to their home. When the angel of judgment came to take the life of the firstborn of the households across the land of Egypt, the angel would pass over the homes that were under the blood of the lamb. Then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, The Feast of Unleavened Bread was originally established at the first Passover. In some ways, it was the second part of Passover, lasting from Nisan 15 to Nisan 21. This was one of 3 feasts which God commanded all the men of Israel to gather before him yearly. For the first Passover, the unleavened bread following was a practical necessity. They left Egypt in such a hurry there was no time to allow for the bread dough to ferment with leaven and rise. After the first Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a testimony throughout your generation. The first fruits. It was not to be observed until Israel came into the land of Canaan that God gave them the command, for the feast was a promise that they would in fact come into the land and possess it. God said, when you come into the land, and not if you come into the land. The Feast of Weeks. 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits, at the completion of the wheat harvest, Israel was to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, also called the Feast of Ingathering, and Pentecost, by bringing a new grain offering to the Lord and offering specific sacrifices. The name Pentecost means 50th day in Greek. This name is used of this festival in the New Testament because the feast was celebrated 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You shall bring from your dwellings 2 waved loaves. In the national ritual celebrating the Feast of Weeks, 2 loaves of bread, something like a modern large pita bread, were waved before the Lord. Remarkably, these 2 loaves were to be baked with leaven. Offer with the bread 7 lambs, 1 young bull, and 2 rams. After the loaves of leavened bread were waved before the Lord, they were offered on the altar along with animal sacrifices as a burnt offering, along with the grain offering and drink offerings. This was highly unusual. Generally speaking, Israel was forbidden from offering any kind of leaven or yeast with a blood offering. There was a specific symbolic message from God in the command to wave 2 leavened loaves of bread before him at the Feast of Weeks, and then to offer those loaves with the burnt offerings. It is a holy convocation to you. When these sacrifices were made at the tabernacle or temple, it was another day of a holy gathering for Israel, and a day of rest. This was one of the 3 feasts at which God commanded all the men of Israel to gather before him yearly. The Feast of Trumpets. In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, on the first day of the month of Tishri, on the Jewish ceremonial calendar, God called for a special day of Sabbath rest and a ceremonial blowing of trumpets. This is the first mention of this feast in the Bible. And then the Day of Atonement. On the 10th of Tishri, the people gathered again for a holy convocation, but this was not a celebration feast, but a day to afflict your souls in humble recognition of sin and the need for atonement. An offering made by fire to the Lord. The priestly sacrifices and ceremonies for the Day of Atonement were described in Leviticus 16. Here the emphasis was on what the individual Israelite did on that day. And you shall afflict your souls. This command was first made in Leviticus 16:29, and both there and here we have no specific description of what it meant to afflict your souls. This has been interpreted as fasting for the entire day, and to make it a day of solemn reflection over one's sins and life the previous year. It was also a day of rest. You shall do no work on that same day. Any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. This strong statement of the command and punishment for disobedience is unique among these instructions for the feasts. In the strongest terms, God wanted his people to use this as a day of humble repentance and to cease from their own work, while the high priest worked hard to make the sacrifice that would bring atonement to the people of God. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You have the high priest there serving this intercessory role, and then the whole of the congregation commanded to rest and to not do any work, lest they be exterminated by God himself, which is just a picture of salvation under Jesus Christ, in that it's not by works of righteousness that we do that we can get right with God, but according to Jesus Christ and his mercy. And yeah, it's only through observing that rest in Jesus Christ that we can get right with God. The Feast of Tabernacles. On the 15th day of the Jewish month, Tishri, on the Jewish ceremonial calendar, was the Feast of Tabernacles. It lasted for 7 days and 1 additional day. This is the first mention of this feast in the Bible. Besides your gifts, besides all your vows. This week was also an appropriate time for people to bring their personal gifts, vows, and free will offerings to the Lord. Alexander Maclaren noted that the Jewish Talmud says that on each of the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles, and according to one rabbi, also on the 8th day, a priest went down to the pool of Siloam and drew water in a golden pitcher, which he brought back to the altar, pouring the water into a silver basin as the worshippers sang psalms from the great Hallel collection of Psalm 113 to 118. This celebrated the water God miraculously provided for Israel in the wilderness. Then on the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out and saying, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." From John 7:37 through 38. Interesting. So, if that were anyone else, it would be the greatest pride to appropriate the symbology of the ritual to himself. But this was God incarnate. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. During the Feast of Tabernacles, Israelite families went to camp out in shelters made with the branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees. During the years of the Exodus, they lived this way all the time because they had to. When they eventually came into the Promised Land, they lived this way for a week to remind them of their hardships in those years and God's good provision in the wilderness. The prophetic significance of the feasts of Leviticus 23. On Israel's calendar, the 4 spring feasts were grouped together, and the 3 fall feasts were also grouped. There was a separation of time between these 2 groups of feasts. As a group, the first 4 feasts point to the work of Jesus and his first coming. His earthly ministry is recorded in the New Testament accounts. The Feast of Passover clearly points to Jesus as our Passover. He was the Lamb of God who was sacrificed and whose blood was received and applied, so the wrath of God would pass us over. The Feast of Unleavened Bread points to the time of Jesus' burial after his perfect, sinless sacrifice on the cross. In this time, Jesus was received by God, the Father, as holy and complete. The Feast of First Fruits points to the resurrection of Jesus, who was the first human to receive resurrection, never to die again. He is the firstborn from the dead, and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. The Feast of Pentecost points to the birth of the church and the harvest of souls that came from it. Between the first set of 4 feasts and the second set of 3 feasts, there is a significant time gap, almost 4 months. This was a time of harvest in Israel, even as our current age is a time of harvest for the church, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The second group of the last 3 feasts points to events associated with the second coming of Jesus. The Feast of Trumpets points to the ultimate holy convocation of God's people at the sound of a trumpet, the rapture of the church. It also points to God's gathering of Israel for his special purposes in the last days. The Day of Atonement not only points to the ultimate perfect atonement Jesus offered on our behalf, but also the affliction and salvation Israel will see during the Great Tribulation. And the Feast of Tabernacles points to the millennium rest and comfort of God for Israel and all of God's people. From its beginning to its end, it is all about peace and rest. Interesting. Anyhow, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.